to have. Yay. I've kind of all got you squished on the left there. I'm wondering whether I should play some music, although I don't know that my music is very good. I'm still stuck in the 80s. It's actually quite sad. Very, very.
Yeah, I think the 80s is now like retro 3 times over.
Well, certainly if I'd have kept half the clothes there, I'd have been a millionaire by selling them. Although I'm not quite sure how this generation would cope with a hypercolour T-shirt.
Didn't they make a little leap back? I'm sure there was like this little moment, like 2014 or something, just like a little.
Gosh, you're asking me to think back. That's a bit much for an old duck like me, let me tell you. So, team, we're just going to wait for a few more people to jump on, and then we're going to get started. Very, very excited for tonight. And you might even get a guest appearance from one of my dogs as it tries to push its way into my study. You never know your luck.
I don't
think anybody would be upset about that. Who doesn't love dogs?
Dogs in tech is cool, but dogs in tech I think is cooler.
Actually, there's an issue with getting attendees in, I think, at the moment. I'm not sure why they can't seem to get in because no one's in at the moment. So I'm just going to have
there I was trying to be on for everybody.
No, you have to do it again.
Yeah, that's right. Okay, so now people are getting in slowly, which is excellent. Okay, so some people are starting soon. Some people are getting in. I think slowly but surely it's just letting people in, which is very exciting. Slowly but surely, so that I can do the whole thing about my dogs all over again and the 80s music and everything else. Reese, if it was you, what kind of music would you be playing?
Oh, geez, I'm not too good with this sort of thing. What kind of music would I play? I don't know why Toto just came to mind, but you know.
Okay,
pretty cool. How about you, Yasmin? What would you be playing?
I don't know, just some like current jams, I reckon. I don't know, just something everyone can get around, I think. Maybe some like, I don't know, feminism jams.
Yeah, I'd put on like Destiny's Child or something.
Yeah, like female.
Yeah, Rona, what's your jam?
Oh, I think Lizzo would suit the vibe, but
yeah,
that's a vibe.
Oh, that would be pretty cool. Nina, what's your thoughts?
Yeah, I like the Lizzo. That's a good idea. Just something, or like I'm a Survivor or something.
Yeah, it's a bit like that at the moment, isn't it?
Mm.
I'm a survivor wearing my Ugg boots. Da, 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 da. We seem to be a bit challenged on people seeing us, which is interesting. So we're just having a look at that and try and figure out what is going on. Slowly, but
it's not making any sense, so I'm not quite sure why. I've got Carlotta. Hang on, let me try and see if I can get Carlotta to help.
Someone's got their email and Slack notifications pinging in the background.
Someone just asked me what my password is. I don't have one. I'm here on a link. That's all I'm doing. Okies. Yep. Teresa, that'd be good. Okay. Sorry, guys.
Right. What's keeping you busy at the moment, Yasmin?
Well, uni's just started, so kind of out at the moment. But it's just been like over the past couple of weeks, it's been lots of media stuff, like around COVID and
That's on Q&A. Awesome.
yeah, like that kind of stuff, and just kind of like advocacy work, like in that space. So like podcasts and written like kind of stuff as well. So yeah, I feel like, I mean, it's died down a little bit, but it was during the proposed cuts to the arts degrees for like at Australian universities, and I spoke a lot about that kind of stuff. So yeah, I guess just kind of writing that way, which has been really interesting. But
That issue settled down. Where have things settled on it?
where have I settled on it?
No, well, where have things in the debate settled? Is it sort of what is done is done, or?
I don't know. I think it was meant to be voted on in Parliament, and I haven't heard anything about it. So I don't know if it has been voted on yet. But so yeah, it was
Like
just
directly COVID related enough
what was that?
to make it into the media. It's not quite directly COVID enough to make it into the top of the news hour.
Yeah, I mean, it was just the whole thing was a really, really bizarre proposal. So yeah, I'd be very concerned if they pass it. Like I have a lot of issues with it. But yeah, I haven't heard anything since. But no, it was good.
I mean, the obvious, yeah. Do you actually think? Does anybody think that a future debt is going to necessarily drive behaviours? Does it? That's the theory, at least.
That was my
We're sort of socially engineering people into appropriate academic pathways.
That was, I mean,
Well,
that
it
was
is kind of social.
yeah, that was my whole argument, because the point of HEX is that you don't actually have to worry about that kind of stuff. So by kind of imposing a future debt, I'm like, well, that's not the point of HEX. When you use HEX and then you look at the uni and the degree and what you want to do in the future, it's not like, what will my total cost be at the end? So I think it's just like, it just completely misunderstands how young people pick degrees in education. And that was my point. I was like, well, if you can't even get that right, and you can't even step into the minds of young people, you're not talking to them. That was my argument. Like, I'm like, you're clearly not actually listening to any young people. So yeah, the whole thing was just really bizarrely thought out, to be honest. But
do not think any young people were consulted in the formation of the policy.
I
think we can support that.
I would agree with that for sure. But yeah, so anyway, but yeah, we'll see how it goes. Hopefully.
So are you studying at the moment, Yasmin?
Yeah, studying. I'm penultimate, so
Okay.
yeah.
Vaguely remember studying, vaguely.
No, I don't mind it. It's a nice like mind break from like other, like, because it's like you put on different hats. So it's like advocacy, uni, just different stuff. But it's first week, so it's chill, which is good. But yeah.
Excellent. So we're just
what's that? Oh, sorry.
Someone's Slack going off.
we're just trying to. Yeah, hi Emma. What do we know?
So I think we're going to have to send the link for the Zoom chat, the Zoom link in the page, because it's just not showing up in the on the on-air site. So are you connected to the on-air site, Karen?
I just clicked the Zoom link. I'm the least. Person.
Can I share this Zoom link in the thing? Do I need a password or anything to access it?
I'm afraid that I am not. Again, you need to. Vanessa is your, but I'm
Are
not.
you on, Emma, are you in the on-air section in the chat area?
I am. I'm just trying to find.
On the right-hand side in the discussion forum, do you want to pop it in there?
Yeah. Is the link just because, oh goodness.
Okay, I see that Paul is in there.
Is that all of us?
Bing, 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 bing.
Oh my God, Susan's getting root canal. Poor darling.
That's excellent. Paul, I don't know if you can hear us or not. He's the guy from Events Air.
Yeah. I did just try and call him, actually.
This is so odd because it says it's all live. Everything should be functioning.
I'm so sorry, gang.
Sorry, I've got somebody here. Just says session start will start soon. So it seems like as if a moderator needs to click go.
Okay, I'm about to post the
There's no go button. That's the problem.
I'm about to post the
Buzz, 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 buzz. In the meantime, let me feature my gorgeous Girls in Tech beanie that we had made specially for our conference, and the mug.
Love.
Very, very exciting. We were discussing what sort of music we would want before, and we're not quite sure what it is that we had everything from my 80s music through to, oh, Reese, I already forgot who. Oh no, we had
Let's not repeat what I had. I wasn't the latest person. Let's just skip me. Let's go straight to the
oh, very exciting.
Has anyone posted it, or will I post this now?
Post the.
It looks like you guys are all signed in as Emma, and we're going to have to can all your videos because you signed in as panelists.
Oh, yeah.
I know, and then we have other people. We're sorry for the technical issues, team. It's nice to see you all having joined us. Slowly but surely we're getting there. It's always the way that when you're at Girls in Tech, every now and then we have tech issues, but it's good to see that we are slowly letting you all in, and we are just going to give everyone a few minutes to join us, and we will make it happen. So give us a few minutes just to allow everyone to jump on board. And then very, very excitingly, we're going to get there.
Hey, Jess, should I share your direct link then? Is that how we all got here?
Yes. Those link. They're all Emma's, but everyone else should be fine, Teresa.
Cool. Thanks.
Paula Rooney.
Oh yeah, Emma's are popping up everywhere. Wow.
Very popular. We're getting there, and of course now the dog wants to come in there. It's always the way. Always the way. So getting there slowly but surely, which is very exciting. It's nice to watch the attendees finally go up after having had tech issues, but we're getting there, which is great.
Yeah, we won't be talking to an empty room. It's good. I get
It's actually very bizarre. Having hosted one of these with an audience and then doing it to a screen, it's Reese, you know what that's like. It's very, very different, isn't it?
It is. It is definitely very different. And remembering that the recording starts 15 minutes before you start speaking is important. We had a pretty high-profile person on Silicon Block Firesides, and you made a bit of commentary before it officially started, and ended up being that headline the next day when it said then. So.
Yeah, that's all right. I'm actually going to learn to keep my potty mouth to myself this time, so there will be no swearing from Karen at all during this broadcast, which is different but interesting nonetheless. So we're going to give everyone a few more minutes just to be able to come in, and then we will get going. And we apologise profusely for the delay. Nothing like having tech issues on a Wednesday. It's nearly the end of July. I think we're just losing it slowly but surely, aren't we?
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely losing it. But that's all good. We're very excited about tonight.
Hi to everyone from Victoria. Because I am a Victorian, but I am not in Victoria at the moment. So,
bragging about. Yes, well, you should try being a Karen who lives in Victoria. What can I tell you? We're in a whole league of our own. Although, I don't know if you saw, but I can get free pizza. Firstly, I would like to begin by acknowledging and paying my respects to the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, the traditional custodians of the land on which we are gathered today. I would like to pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Welcome to our second Girls in Tech Virtual Girl Boss Night. My name is Karen Katz, we've already established that. And I have the privilege of serving on the board of Girls in Tech Australia. We are a not-for-profit organisation run by passionate individuals committed to the empowerment, networking and education of women in the technology sector. Anyone who has been to a physical Girl in Tech event knows our overwhelming commitment to wine and cheese. Just because we've gone digital doesn't mean that our commitment is any less. So here is the challenge. Grab a picture of the wine and cheese that you have next to you and post it to socials with the hashtag GirlBossNight. And you could be running to win. You could be in the running to win the beanie and mug pack. This is serious business. This is limited edition and heavily sought after. So make sure that you get through that. Tonight's agenda will work in 3 parts. We'll be hearing from our amazing panel, give you the chance to ask some questions, and then answer questions that you're keen to have answered, and also offer you the opportunity to network with your fellow attendees after the session. Before we begin, I'd like to say a special thank you to the ever amazing Jamuna Raj for your hard work in taking the lead on this event and driving us to deliver it. Together with Susan He, Vanessa Curtis, Emma Franklin and various members of our board, they've ensured that we will hopefully enjoy a smooth running event from here on in. I'd also like to thank our sponsors for tonight, our national partners GitLab and Servian, as well as tonight's event partner Hays. You will have noticed that you are not using Zoom tonight, but the platform of Events Air, who have been a great supporter of us as well. So we would like to say thank you to them. We can't deliver our events without supporters like you, so huge thank you to you all. At this point, I'd like to introduce Tina Kanoko from Hays to briefly speak to you all about their partnership with Girls in Tech. All yours, Tina.
Thanks so much, Karen. Great pronunciation of my last name, by the way. So excited to be a part of today, and all of us at Hays are so proud to be a sponsor of Girls in Tech again this year. I've had the opportunity to be a part of Girls in Tech for the past 2 years, and it's honestly been such a revelation to see such a group of strong, successful individuals really come together and drive such an important cause forward. I've been in the recruitment industry within sales tech over 10 years and definitely faced that initial adversity coming into a really male-dominated industry. In the past, I've worked for organizations that didn't value diversity and that weren't inclusive of certain individuals based on their background, their gender, their sexual preference. I've also consulted with those types of organizations and had an uphill battle of clients, telling me they wanted a short list of only men, or they didn't want, certain individuals included in that. And, despite my best efforts of trying to prove how much worth diversity has, would ultimately not have to, not work with those organizations. On the flip side of things, we do see businesses who value this, and we have certain clients that will, only allow shortlisted 50-50 men and women, and who, request CVs to have the names left off so that they're really taking a look at screening candidates in a non-biased and equal way. I wanted to share just a quick story of a client that I recruited for with Hays in the Gold Coast. I placed a candidate with this client and called in just to ensure that everything was going well. The client explained to me that the week before, Joseph, who I had placed in the role, came into the office with a full face of makeup, fully in a beautiful dress, high heels, and newly introduced herself to the team as Josephina. Obviously, everybody was quite shocked, but the client explained to me just how elated she was at how everybody embraced Josephina, and how she was really proud that, she had created a work environment where Joe felt comfortable to, be able to come in and really express who she was. Although there is, a really long way to go, it's really encouraging to hear stories like this and hear about, how businesses are specifically asking for that diversity and, even creating their own diversity programs in their workplaces. I'm also really proud to work for an organization now that really promotes this, not only internally, but as well as with our clients, and where the change is really coming from the top with our CEO and the Global DEI Council that he's put in place. Across our business, we're about 65% female. Our board of directors is 60% female. And on a more local scale in our IT recruitment team, we sit at about 40% women. So, all of that makes me just really happy and proud. And again, thanks so much, Karen, for allowing me to speak and share how important this is to us at Hays and how much we really value the partnership and the work that you guys at Girls in Tech are doing. And really excited to hear from the amazing group of panelists and learn, really what diversity and inclusion looks like in 2020.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks for that, Tina. Girls in Tech has explored both diversity and inclusion at previous events, but with a company or corporate lens. Tonight, we are more interested in the personal, how our panelists have experienced the evolution of the awareness and behaviour of the people around them. Today we have supported the launch of Share the Platform campaign, which is about giving Black and Indigenous and people of colour founders an opportunity to share the platform of successful startups in order to tell their stories. Our Managing Director, Jess Box, has added our contribution to this fantastic initiative. If you would like any more information on that, please go to oneloveaustralia.org /share the platform. Now more than ever, we want, expect, and actually deserve more from the people and companies we deal with every day. Given recent events, both in Australia and internationally, that have demonstrated anything but an inclusive mindset, this is a conversation that we have to have. We know it's a really tough one, so we appreciate your support for our speakers as they open up to you about this really important conversation. Our speakers tonight are Yasmin Poole, a youth advocate and AFR Top 100 Women of Influence, Rona Glynn McDonald, the CEO of Common Ground, and Reese Hayes, founder and CEO of IE Digital. To begin, I'm going to ask each speaker to tell us about themselves and why diversity and inclusion is so important to them on a personal level. And Yasmin, I'm going to start with you.
Thanks so much, Karen, and thank you so much, everyone, for tuning in tonight. A really, really topical and important discussion, and it's such a privilege to share the virtual floor with my other panelists, so it's an honour. But I guess in terms of how I would answer that question, I mean, it's such a hugely important question to me, but I can pinpoint, I guess, my moment that I really started caring about this stuff, or at least I realised that this is something that I really wanted to work on and be part of my work. And it was way back in year 10 and in 2014. And it was the year that ISIS was really dominating the headlines. And having a Muslim mother, I was hearing a lot of Islamophobia, especially thrown in casually, even around my school. And at the time, you know, being in that environment, it was something that had, you know, often happened, but something that we didn't really talk about. We didn't really talk about casual racism. We didn't talk about, I guess, what that means more broadly. So it was something that made me feel really frustrated and disempowered and angry, to be honest. So for me, I guess my moment that of agency was a public speaking speech. And it was some really insignificant, small competition. And I entered it and we could speak about anything. And I thought, what do I care about? And I thought about my mum, and I thought about all the racist experiences she had had over her life and what it felt like as her daughter to witness that continually. For example, you know, she had to stop wearing the hijab early on, you know, after 9/11 because of casual racism and harassment. People assumed she couldn't speak English. People, even, you know, from the lens of a, you know, high school student, I could see when people looked down on her and treated her differently because of what she looked like. So I did that speech and I spoke my truth. And I remember when I was speaking that speech, there was a young man in the audience, and he was sitting next to his mother, who also was wearing the hijab. And we had this moment of understanding. And it was, we locked eyes and we both knew that it wasn't just my experiences, it wasn't just his experiences, it was our collective experiences that so often weren't discussed. And for me, it was the first time that I actually used those experiences as a moment of agency instead of feeling of being disempowered. And the first time that I could weave my experiences as a source of strength instead of something that made me feel ashamed or upset or sad. And it was that moment for me that still centers everything that I do. If I go into, you know, places that lack cultural diversity or lack diversity, I feel like I'm one of the only ones there, I think back to that moment and I think I needed to see myself there, or I need to use these experiences to represent something far bigger than me. And I guess that's really what started my passion, because to me, I always say, if we can start that moment of agency in young people, you know, that's powerful, because that lightning bolt moment is something that can, you know, shape someone's career and future and path, and to use those experiences again for something bigger than. So I think that was really my turning point, and something that's kind of shaped this really crazy roller coaster journey so far.
Thank you. That's just awesome. Rona, I'm going to throw to you.
Thank you so much for having me here tonight. My name is Rona. I'm a Kayditch woman from Central Australia, and I'm calling in on this panel from Wurundjeri country in Melbourne. I just want to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land that I'm on today and pay my respects to elders and ancestors from the Kulin Nation that look out for me on country while I'm here as a visitor. I was really lucky to grow up on Arrernte country in Central Australia, surrounded by the rich cultures of First Nations people within the region. And as an Aboriginal woman, I felt incredibly lucky to have that connection to the oldest cultures in the world. As a Kaditch woman, I came to Melbourne about 6 years ago and went to a university and left my home back home in Central Australia. And it was actually the moments, you know, in university, surrounded by extreme privilege, that I began to recognise how little so many Australians knew about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, our cultures and our histories. And it was those conversations that I was having with people at university when they'd ask me about, you know, my Aboriginality, trying to understand how I could walk between worlds in Central Australia, worlds in Melbourne, with fair skin, blonde hair and connection to country. And it really inspired me to go on a bit of a learning journey myself to understand how little we get in terms of education around Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And those gaps, I believe, are gaps that breed systemic racism, and the structures that we have in our country is that lack of understanding and lack of connection. So I founded an organisation called Common Ground, which records and shares First Nations cultures and history to try and create a society that celebrates and embraces all First Nations people. I guess diversity and inclusion for me is about creating a world in which the next generation, all my young community members, can step into the world and have any opportunity and every opportunity afforded to them that everyone else does, so they can aspire to, you know, meet their aspirations and dreams, and they're not held back in any way or form. And, you know, my belief is that for us to really talk about diversity and inclusion, we need to talk about systemic racism and what it means to really shift that in this nation and recognise that we all exist on stolen and unceded lands, and how we can all actively promote, as individuals and collectives, a society that includes and celebrates First Nations people.
Thanks, Rona. That is just awesome. Actually, very inspiring. Reese, can I throw to you?
That's not going to work when I'm on mute. Thank you, Karen. And thank you so much. I'm really honoured to share this forum with my co-panelists, both of whom I have a connection to in another way. So it's terrific to be here again on the Girls in Tech stage, this time virtual. Yeah, my story is, it is very personal, as all of our stories are. And it's sort of the first time I've told this story, so I'm sort of going from off the cuff. I am not a girl boss. I don't know whether that's particularly evident to everybody, but I am a gay boss. The reality is that I wasn't always a gay boss. I actually started IE when I was 20. I'm 39 now. And when I was 29, I had to come to terms with my own identity. It's interesting talking about this now. I think the next question, I know you're going to come to this, but the world has changed substantially in the last 10 years. But it felt at that time for me incredibly public. It was a terrifying experience. It was a journey into the deep unknown at a time when I was a public figure, not a public figure, but a visible figure in my universe. My universe at that point in time was the world of advertising and marketing with a sort of technology bent to it. And I had spent really my entire life until that point crafting an identity that I was very proud of. It was a white male heterosexual, and I loved it. And the saddest thing is that you have to call into question what kind of society has led somebody to love a false identity, or perhaps inversely to be so afraid of their own true identity as to have been so ashamed. And that was a very personal journey for me to have to confront. In that sort of persona that I'd adopted, that I enjoyed so much, I was ignorant to, or I ignored really a reality of the world around me, and I enjoyed all the privileges that come with that kind of identity. And when I first came out, as the term is, or came to terms with my own truth, one of the first observations I made was the extraordinary language that people used, completely ignorant of how it impacted me. Latent homophobia was around me everywhere. It was even in my own language, actually. And I vividly recall one particular experience where I was sitting in my own boardroom with people that actually worked for me. It was senior management, a couple of senior management. There were 3 guys, they were all men, sitting in the room with me, very senior. And the language and the commentary in the room was all laced with homophobia, highly sexually suggestive. And nobody thought anything of it, except for me, who was crushed. Actually, I was absolutely mortified. I felt vulnerable. I felt naked. I felt that this was directed at me intentionally. And I didn't know what to do. I felt utterly and entirely exposed for the first time in my life. And it was vulgar, to be perfectly honest. It was deeply, deeply offensive to me. And yet, absolutely, these people cared about me. They thought nothing of it, knowing that I had only just 6 months ago come out. This language was perfectly acceptable. This gesturing was perfectly acceptable. And it was at that moment that I stepped across a line from that previous persona to feeling utterly alone and isolated in a room, and utterly different in a way that I felt I could never come back to. And it has always got me to thinking that if I, still with 2 out of 3, white and male, and in that instance, the boss, and therefore theoretically the person with the greatest level of psychological safety, could be reduced to that feeling, and I don't know how else to describe that feeling, but that feeling has pervaded my, on and off in my life ever since, then how the hell does everybody else feel? And what is it actually like to live and walk in other people's shoes? And that for me has stuck with me to this day. I still find myself having to come out all the time because we live in a society that has an expectation of who I might be, and I can get to know people for a long time and be invited to bring my wife and my kids along to a family get-together. For somebody I've been talking to for 6 months, only to have the awkward conversation. There's no wife, there's no kids yet. There might be a husband at some point soon. Anyway, so it's been an interesting journey. Looking forward to sharing more. Thank you, Karen.
Thank you so much, Reece. It's so incredibly personal, and I appreciate that from all 3 of you to give us that so quickly in the conversation. It's interesting that you raised the point around safety, because I think that is probably one of the biggest challenges that we have in this space, is people feeling unsafe because of who they are and because of the blatant non-acceptance of just who we are as people. Moving along, I'm interested in your personal perspective on how you've seen any tangible change or improvement in the area of diversity and inclusion, if any, over, say, the last 5 to 10 years. Rona, I'd love you to jump in on that one.
Yeah, I think in the context of the last 5 to 10 years, we have seen pretty significant shifts for sure. And particularly the last few months, there's more diversity and inclusion strategies, there's more quotas, there's more reconciliation action plans than we've ever seen before. But I still believe that we have a very long way to go. We're starting to talk about this stuff more and more, and we're getting better language and people are thinking about it in their consciousness. But, when we look at diversity and inclusion, I think that the language we use sometimes abdicates the responsibility of organizations or individuals or institutions to really look at the way that they can use their power or privilege to shift systems. Sometimes it's a bit of like a smoothing of, the existing problems rather than looking at the root of a problem to actually create a new system, and rather than just, addressing the symptoms of it, look at the system itself. So when I think about, the way we're approaching it, I really think that we need to start having more conversations about this structural racism that, is visible, but it's also invisible. And, these strategies and these quotas and this action is all great, but it takes, individual action and collective action to really shift the dial on this. We need people to be actively recognizing the privilege and the power that they hold and see that power to make space for others. Like if we look across governments, institutions, most not-for-profit boards, directors, CEOs, predominantly they're still cis white men. And, you know, we're not seeing that shift at a leadership level that we really need to be seeing in this space. I believe that, you know, we're not using language like intersectionality in ways that we need to think about diversity and inclusion just extends beyond black and white. There's so much more there in terms of people's lived experience, and so much more in terms of the backgrounds and the intersections that everyone holds within, you know, the systems they exist within. I'm a fair-skinned Kaditch woman. I walk in this world with a lot of privilege because I've got fair skin. And I don't think, you know, our conversations around diversity and inclusion are starting to have enough depth where we talk about colorism, we talk about, you know, positionality as well. So I think we have a lot to go. We have a really long way to go in terms of that language and thinking about how we might be able to continue to push for more and really think about the power structures that we sit within and how we can actually make space rather than just writing the strategies and just filling the quotas and just amplifying voices. You know, there's always more we can do, but I think it's heartening to see in the last 5 to 10 years. I'm a very young person, I'm only 24, but I think within the last 5 years in my professional career, I've seen, you know, significant shifts in this area.
It's so true when you talk about like the multitude of the shades of grey, really. It's you're spot on there. Reese, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, thanks for that, Rona. I want to make 2 points here. I think that, first of all, I think that when you refer to the last decade, it's been 10 years, it's probably 10 years ago that incident in my boardroom happened. That, you know, I think that the LGBTQI community would acknowledge that the last decade has been a watershed decade, you know, highlighted obviously with gay marriage. And the first point I would make is that I think, before I go into some of the ongoing challenges, is that I think that what, you know, broadly what we would call gay rights has achieved can be held up as a beacon of hope for all minority communities, because the journey from the peak of the AIDS crisis in the 90s, in the early 90s, to the moment that people of all types and backgrounds were able to marry, is an example of the way in which organised, careful, focused, community-based action can lead to societal change. And the structures and the way in which the LGBTQI community came together to make that happen is very important, and I think it can be held up for broader society too, to understand it can change. I mean, we all know of the grandmother, the auntie, the uncle that sort of had a mindset shift over that journey, and it makes us all feel great. So I think that's an enormous positive. I think that the danger with that is what I would call job done mentality. I think that you've got to think about diversity and inclusion, or sort of the process of, you know, it is part of the process of becoming a better society. And I think that we can perceive it as job done, in that, in actual fact, it's tidal and it's progressive and it's a journey without end. So in other words, it's tidal, and as in we take steps forward and we take steps back. When we look particularly at the LGBTQI community, the greatest danger is that, though I had that experience in 2009 and I'm very unlikely to have that experience in 2020, that's because I live in bubbles up here in the Northern Rivers in Northern New South Wales, or in Melbourne. I live in inner urban areas where, you know, mindset shifts have changed. I only have to drive 30 kilometres that way. I'm up near Byron Bay and I land in Lismore, and I find very different societal attitudes. No offence to people from Lismore. The job done mentality is very much about, I think that there is a social view that, relief, it's over. What the hell are you complaining about anymore? That can, you know, that's perhaps a bit in broad brushstrokes, but I think that the issue is that issues remain, and they remain hidden, and they become often dark or passive. So once out of plain sight, that doesn't mean that racism's gone away. It often means that it's actually hidden, and I think that's a major problem in the US. I won't try and unpack that. But I think that that's a risk, that it is tidal, and we have taken enormous steps forward, and I think that each issue has its moment in that tidal process. But I'll leave it at that. Thanks, Karen.
Thank you, Reese. Yasmin, the last 5 to 10 years have looked very different for you, given the 5 years ago you were a teenager.
Yeah, I think, I mean, it does look a lot different, and it's been crazy different. But I guess my reflections on that, I think that we've seen a shift in that when we talk about things like sexism and racism, I think we see less incidences of overt racism and overt sexism, but there is still a long way to go in terms of addressing the achieving institutional structural change. But, you know, even when saying that, you look at COVID-19 and the impact on Asian Australians and the scarily lightning quick moment that we started to see massive spikes of racist attacks against Asian Australians. And that's only one example. But to me, it reaffirms that, at least looking at a race perspective, there remains a conditionality of existence for people of colour. So despite the progress we've made, and I speak as an Asian Australian, despite the progress Asian Australians have been making into, you know, media and leadership, albeit it's still little and lacking, but there was still progress, it can turn really fast. And I think if we want to think about, you know, spaces that we need to work on, look at Parliament as a barometer for where we're at. We are seeing an increased amount of women, but if we look at the number of women on cabinet, it has barely shifted since 2013. It's increased by 1, and during that time it actually went down. We've still only had 1 female prime minister, and if we look at the cultural diversity, it's incredibly lacking. So, you know, I think when we think about this, that there has been a shift in language. You know, even the way that we talk, instead of minorities and immigrants, it's people of colour and BIPOC, and there's lots of different ways to phrase it. But now we need leaders and institutions to actually do action. And if we look at the Black Lives Matter protests, we saw a lot of, you know, statements made by corporate leaders, but I noticed that they couldn't even say the word racism. They talked about discrimination and societal problems, but they couldn't have frank and candid and open conversations. And not only that, to actually put in tangible actions that they will do to ensure that there isn't systemic racism within their institutions and corporations. So while we don't see really clear and obvious examples of the racism, sexism, homophobia, it remains, I guess, subtly embedded within our institutions. And, you know, as a woman of colour, I know very well that I walk on a tightrope. And if I say something wrong or I make a mistake, I can very well put myself in the firing line in a way that white individuals don't have to face. So there is still that fear. In saying that, I think as the recent protests demonstrate, we do want to have these conversations and we do want to talk about it. And I think there is a culture of change shifting. But that, as Reese said, you know, we're far from finished. It is always a work in progress, and there's always so much still to be done.
I have to agree. It's funny, you know, my late father grew up in South Africa, in an era where there was little expectation of diverse or inclusive behaviour. And I'm actually embarrassed to say that I couldn't even repeat some of the language that he used when I was growing up. You know, and I contrast that to the current day where we see examples of the society uproar, as you say, with respect to Black Lives Matter, where social media has been ignited by the outrage of inequality. So I guess my question to you is what do you think has changed over time that has seen the next generation be more demanding of a more inclusive society, and are they demanding enough? And I guess I preface this by I take myself back to when my oldest child was 7, she's 17 now. And somehow the topic of marriage equality came up, and she goes, "Mum, I don't get it. It's not fair. Why can't they just do it?" And, you know, to be able to answer her with, well, society are a bunch of assholes, it's not good enough. And I love to tell the story about the marriage equality vote, where my husband and I put our voting papers on the table, gave the pencils to our girls, and we said, "You vote, you make this change." Anyway, back to the question. Reese, I'm going to throw to you. So what do you think has changed over time that has seen the next generation be more demanding?
So this is a fascinating question, and we could have just spent hours just on this question alone. First of all, my observations come predominantly from being an employer for 20 years, and we probably being in technology where there's a bit of a youth skew, and we've always had a graduate program. So we do get a little bit of a bird's eye view of the changing dynamics in young people. And we're also, as an organisation, you know, have a view on society because of the work that we do. In my opinion, the generation coming up, people aged probably 16 to 25, broadly speaking, if I was to create a bucket, are the first truly unique generation, at a minimum since maybe the baby boomers, and certainly as far as my sort of cursory research goes that I'm aware of. And I think that that's obviously brought about by just growing up in an entirely different environment, driven by technology, social media, and I think that those catchphrases just really understate the significance of social change that's occurred very recently. I think what sits at the core of it is that what underpins sort of racism or sexism or fear of the other in any way, shape, or form is not of any use. It's purposeless. It's meaningless. If you can imagine a forum or a place in time where even the fact that we're having this conversation feels kind of redundant. And Naomi Klein made an observation. I can't remember which book it is because it's an amazing story of a group of 5 young people in New York, and that they literally were a complete mix. You had black, white, gay, straight, poor, rich, the works, a technicolor universe, and they were 5 best friends. And when they came to be studied, they were asked questions like, what is it about, you're from completely different socioeconomic backgrounds. How do you find commonality? You're from a different environment, you're different, whatever. And they just looked blankly. They were like, we don't understand the premise of the question. We all love the same games and we play basketball together, so we're friends. We don't understand why you're even understanding it. They did not understand the notion of why this was a significant question to ask. And that is obviously our final destination, is not necessarily to, I think I live in a generation where this is a conversation about the right thing to do. I would go so far as to say that Yasmin and Rona belong to a generation where it is not the right thing to do. It is the only thing to do. It makes no sense. And my handball question as part of this to either Yasmin or Rona is, when you talk about this, do you feel like you're talking up predominantly as opposed to talking to your peers? Up in age is what I'm talking about.
Yeah, I think absolutely it does feel like that. It does feel like we're talking up because young people are incredibly compassionate. I've heard people call, this generation, my generation, Yasmin's generation, calling us Generation Compassion, because we have so much empathy and compassion for other people, wherever they come from, whatever they bring, whatever their lived experience, we have compassion for them. And I think that there is a lot of, us as young people trying to mobilize older generations, and it's exhausting across, every different sector and system. But within the context of, diversity and inclusion, I think that the last 2 months after, the murder of George Floyd and what the Black Lives Matter movement has meant in Australia, we saw a groundswell of young people across Australia turning up to support in protest, despite a global pandemic, despite the health risks, knowing that this was our only opportunity to really take action and our only opportunity to raise and amplify the voices of Black, Brown and First Nations people across Australia and the globe. And I think it's demonstrations like that where you see thousands and thousands of young people turning up and showing up to support, where you recognise that this is all changing and it's changing very fast. And I have a lot of hope in young people. I think that, we see a movement like that and how it's been imported into Australia and how organisations and institutions have responded, with diversity and inclusion strategies, with restructuring organisations, with finding diverse faces for campaigns, with, black tiles. But changing the face means nothing unless we change our hearts and our minds. And I think that young people feel that, and we know that, and we're going to continue to demand for more. And, because all, the good intentions and optics are never enough, and we need to be shifting, the structures and systems that underpin them. And I think that this young generation will continue to demand for change. I certainly will. I know Yasmin will. I'm sure there's many other young people who are watching right now that also will. So I think there's a lot of hope that, the change that we want to see is being made and will continue to be made.
And Aisha will give you a warm hug.
I was going to say, you certainly give this old duck a lot of hope. Yasmin, why, aside from the fact that you obviously have very personal story, what is it that you see amongst your friends and your peers?
Yeah, I mean, first to address Reese's point, yeah, absolutely. I would agree with Rona that it very much feels like this is just common knowledge and this stuff should just be done. But also I know that, you know, to bring everyone in, we need to kind of frame this debate and still talk about it. But it does just seem like common sense coming from my perspective. But maybe this is a naive young person speaking, but I don't think so. I think this is the way of the future. But in terms of, you know, what I think is changing our generation, I think the first answer is globalization and the interconnectedness of young people across the world. And that's especially through things like social media, because we know that, you know, even in areas that don't have lots of representation, as in very homogenous societies, are actually more vulnerable to fear the other because they're not in communities. So, you know, that I think that's probably one thing, you know, growing up, I mean, maybe not necessarily when I grew up in the country, but, you know, where I am now, it's incredibly multicultural. So I think that's the first thing. The second thing though, which actually just struck me as I was listening to the other panelists, totally random, but I think it also reflects the fact that at least before COVID, we've had relatively good economic prosperity. And the reason why I talk about that is because governments in times of crisis can often use language to demonize the other. And we've seen that, you know, around the idea of boat people, around the idea of migrants sucking up all our resources and jobs and infrastructure to I guess, mask poor policy and try to shift blame. And considering we've been, at least, I mean, I know there's the GFC, but relatively successful, I wonder if it's also maybe that the government's rhetoric hasn't been as strong in terms of demonizing, but in saying that, it very much still exists. I guess what I'm trying to say is that young people have better access to information that isn't directly coming from certain politicians. And that really means something, because it means that we can critically analyze the kind of language that is used, especially, you know, racist language. And, you know, when you spoke about your father and South Africa and that kind of stuff, I think that also reflects that there was an absence of debate and an absence of free and open conversation to really nitpick or unpack exactly what politicians are saying. And that's not to say racism isn't inherent in politics. It absolutely is. But I think with that access of information and that diverse, I guess, upbringing that we've in a way collectively shared as young people means that we can scrutinize and see what that actually is and work to address it, instead of listening and absorbing and taking it in as our own views.
It's funny, we just know it's just wrong.
Yeah.
Back in the day, they had no concept that it was just wrong. Now we know it's just wrong, and we've got to do something about it. Given that you're at university, and that's always been a boiling pot of politics and activism, were you noticing any change in the behaviour of students on campus? Like when you were there, of course, now you're not allowed to go anywhere, but back in the day when you were actually on campus?
Yeah, I think yes and no. So in terms of yes, I mean, I can only point to my university right now, and the ethnocultural department is doing, you know, a campaign around racism and talking about even concepts like white supremacy, which is quite an inflammatory term, but having really frank and open conversations around this stuff and really centering the words of, you know, Black and Indigenous students and academics at the center of this. So just really, really brave and open conversations in that space. But at the same time, I'm very aware that going to university, I attend an elite institution with, you know, elite ideals and often attracting a certain type of people. And being, again, you know, as a person of color and someone that comes from a low income background, that has still been alienating. And I still see ingrained privilege. And if I look at dormitories, you know, talking from my experience, it's incredibly affluent and white and does not look like the multicultural society that I describe. So yes, there has been a shift in universities and young people and open-mindedness. And I think we can see that with Black Lives Matter and the social media movement and the push to educate others. I think that was really significant. But I still have heard undercurrents of problematic language. And again, it may not be overtly racist, but I think the role of institutions now is to think about what kind of generations of young people they are creating and the importance of diversifying those cohorts. Because if we're creating future leaders, it has to look diverse. Otherwise, we're going to get the same result as what we see in Parliament today. In saying that, though, I have been fortunate to have so many amazing young people in my circle that go to university that have expanded what I think and challenged what I know. We have amazing debates and conversations that can be difficult, but so important and validating. So I think it's the willingness to talk about this and the willingness to listen above all else that has really struck me at university, and something that's taught me a lot.
Fantastic. I get as CEOs, what do you see as your responsibility, and how successful have you been in shifting the dial in your own organisations? I'm also curious to know which diversity pillars you've prioritised, if any. Rhona, I'm going to go to you first on that one.
Yeah, great. I run a not-for-profit that is very small, but we're Black run, Black governed, Black led. But even within that context, you know, as a First Nations org, there is things that we need to name and I need to be conscious of as a founder when I'm, you know, growing and scaling this not-for-profit. And, you know, I talked about colorism previously and mentioned, you know, this idea of positionality. Like for myself as a Kadich woman with fair skin and, you know, blonde hair, I have privilege in the world that I walk in, and doors open for me because of that. And, you know, not all community members where I'm from have that same privilege. So I think as an individual founder, I constantly have to be thinking about, you know, the privilege that I hold and actually the space that I occupy that sometimes needs to be a space that other people would occupy. So, you know, our work is about recording and sharing First Nations cultures and histories, and we have to be so intentional about, you know, which First Nations voices are we recording and which ones are we amplifying, and where are they coming from? Because, you know, I have my own lived experience as a Kadich woman, but, you know, there's other marginalized communities and there's community members other than me that need to have their voices amplified. So I think when I approach diversity and inclusion, I'm always thinking about positionality and the way that, you know, there are intersections for First Nations community outside of just being First Nations people. You know, my hope is that as a CEO, I'm building an organization where in a few years I'll be able to step away and another young Black person will be able to lead it who has a completely different lived experience to me and is able to bring, you know, a different diversity and a different skill set and a different way of thinking to the table. And I think that, you know, if we can create an organization that thrives and does have that intersectional experience for First Nations people, then that's an absolute strength. So that's what I really focus on.
I look forward to watching that happen. I'm going to keep a very close eye on you now, Missy. You watch. Reece, how about from IE's perspective?
So what do I see as my responsibilities and how successful do I think I've been? So it's a self-assessment. I think that the role of leadership, if I can call it more broadly that, is one of champion, and to really set the right tone. But at the same time, we actually have to recognize that we actually come with our own unconscious bias into any circumstance. So whilst there's a responsibility to, first of all, champion, create the appropriate space and to walk the walk, the reality is that we will walk our own natural path. I am who I am. I am not a first generation Australian. I'm not a First Nations Australian. I'm not an Asian Australian. And I don't have any right to speak on their behalf, nor do I have any right to presume what their needs are. In relation to IE, we've made all the mistakes along the way. And one of the things that's actually quite interesting around an organisation that you believe as a leader is a liberal, socially progressive, diverse organisation, as we would hope to consider IE is, what that actually means is perhaps under the surface not what you would expect, because it's not a monoculture of ideas. That's not what we created. It's not a singular notion of acceptance, because we have people from all sorts of backgrounds and who hold all sorts of views and have all sorts of issues. And that was a lesson learned, because if in that environment you elevate any one particular issue, you do that to the exclusion of others. And that becomes one of the challenges of establishing a diversity and inclusion strategy, because you inherently politicize internally what it is that you're actually trying to do. So, and I'm not against those. We have had one, and I would like us to have a diversity and inclusion panel again. What we have at the moment is a social committee with a charter to ensure that we solve for actually the problem I was just talking about, that as we elevated issues, or as, to be perfectly honest, the leader or leaders in the organisation ran their own biases, whilst we thought what we were doing tick the socially progressive, little L liberal boxes, we left a whole array of people behind. So it's actually about creating the opportunity for bottom-up progressive ideals. I'll go back to the point that I made, my point, that Karen, I think you called out. It's about creating a psychologically safe space that people can express their own views in, and know that those views can be heard, and that if it's delivered with respect and there's an interest in the debate of ideas, that our organisation will, we're not necessarily for or against anybody. What we are for is a psychologically safe environment for people to be able to express themselves, to feel included, and to not feel that there's a way that they have to conform to in order to progress both personally and professionally.
Thank you for that. And I now need to own my moment of doing the wrong thing. I addressed Rona as Missy earlier. That was being very Grandma Karen of me. So I just need to apologise and put that on the table right here, right now. I just admitted it out of my mouth. I went, great one, Karen. That's what you want to do in the middle of this kind of a conversation. Anyway, owning it, moving forward. But thank you for that, Reece. A number of companies feel like they can just fix their diversity mix by just introducing hiring quotas. And I lived this at a previous organisation where, yeah, don't bring me a short list unless it's, you know, just bring me all the females, like as an example, which was very difficult to live at the time. What are your thoughts on that? And how do you think we can be doing this better? Like, how does that make the inclusivity piece come to life if we are just working to quotas? Yasmin, I'm interested in your thoughts.
Yeah, I think that I think quotas are very important, but I think there is a very bad way to go about quotas also. And to illustrate what that might look like, I recently did an interview for a consulting internship, and I asked about diversity and the initiatives of that company, and that person said, oh, well, we have a lot of diversity. There's a diversity in the Myers-Briggs personality. We have a guy with blue hair in the office. That's crazy. And I was like, wow, like truly transformative, man. So I think that quotas is initially important in terms of actually, getting people in the door, I suppose. But it doesn't just end in terms of hiring. I think this is a problem that companies always seem to make. They say, oh, well, we have, X amount of women graduates, and then they kind of leave it at that. Oh, we have X amount of, culturally diverse people, and leave it at that. And that is absolutely not the point of quotas. Quotas is only one part to, again, reshape and rethink structures and the way that they view and promote leadership. So if we look at the way that leadership is conceived, and I saw this crazy statistic today, 7% of leaders in the top ASX 200 companies are called Andrew. 5% are women. So the role of quotas is to rethink what we view leadership to be, and leadership still continues to be largely shaped by white male attributes, and doesn't inherently value women or any other kind of culturally diverse group, etc., etc. And I think a reason for that is that it's one thing to have quotas, but the actual structure, again, of the workforce, of politics or whatever, fails to consider differences. So even if we look at women perform double the amount of time at home in household duties, undertaking the burden of care. There is a difference in expectations that we can continue to place on women. If we look at Asian Australians, for example, the reason why they often miss out on leadership opportunities is because they can be viewed as too meek or too mild or not challenging authority, despite that often being a cultural strength, because Asian Australians use consensus-based approach. So the role of quotas isn't just to get people in the door, it's to reshape, again, what we view leadership to be. And I think an important way to do that is to ensure that it's actually a safe space to support these kind of communities. And what does that mean? That could be, networking, that could be, spaces set out for culturally diverse Australians or women or whatever that may be. And I think that's really important. So I think ultimately, we need to actually be from the top down, reshaping how we view and understand leadership and the roadblocks that still exist in order to actually get to the top level positions. That's the important part of quotas, not just getting people in the door.
Excellent. That's an awesome viewpoint. Thank you. Reece, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, really interesting one that I personally have been on a bit of another personal journey on. So I used to be anti-quotas, but I won't go into why. Quotas are good, in my opinion. And the reason being is that quotas bring clarity. So there is, if you just heard, Yasmin's stats there, that is a problem to solve. So the first reality is that there is an abundance of research that shows that diversity brings increased performance. Where in a world, particularly in COVID, where innovation is going to drive growth, there is a fundamental, proven, psychological, scientific reality that appropriate diversity brings greater levels of business performance. There is also a societal momentum behind this that means that it fundamentally is happening. The reality is quotas are good for everyone except for, the majority, which is Andrew. That is the difficulty of correcting a historical wrong and wanting to do it rapidly. If we wanted to do this over 100 years, maybe we don't need quotas. If we want to create social change at an appropriate pace, then for a period of time, we do need quotas. I agree with everything that Yasmin said. So the point that I'll make is that clarity becomes fundamentally important, because in the absence of transparency, which quotas bring, you end up with this fear that is increasingly pervading the white male mindset that's reported on as well. This is why we have number one cause of domestic terrorism in the United States is actually white males sitting at home. And I think that this is part of an erosion of identity that's occurring. And I know that this is almost going a bit off track from quotas, but the reason why I think things like quotas are important is surfacing and bringing clarity to the world and why it's important, gives a sense of certainty, even if it's not the certainty you want, for everybody to progress.
Thank you for that. Rona, did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, I think that what Yasmin said really resonates with me around, quotas allow us to rethink and reshape systems. And I think that's fantastic. It's so needed. And as Reece said, we need to be speeding this up. We need it to be happening now. So quotas give us a mechanism to shift those systems. But what we need to be looking at as well is coupling those systems or those quotas with cultures that value that lived experience. Because you might get someone in the door, but if you don't value them, then what's the point? That's why, spaces like Goldman Sachs, they get women through the door, but then in their 20s after their grad roles, they all drop out because the culture does not, permit them to have other aspirations outside of their work. If that culture doesn't value, how they want to run or lead their lives or their lived experience, then it's not, providing for the mechanism in which we're being inclusive and diverse. I've seen some really interesting examples recently of organizations that will bring in people with, culturally or linguistically diverse backgrounds through a quota, but then actually pay them a lived experience loading. So they'll pay them on top of their salary a loading that values their expertise that they bring from their culture and their history and their background to the work that they're doing. And I think that actually valuing that cultural capital is incredibly important. So we're valuing that as expertise and professional expertise alongside, your degrees and your skill sets. And I think it's that kind of shift that we need to be seeing alongside a quota to ensure that we're really starting to build those inclusive workforces that don't just get people in the door, but allow them to thrive and grow in that workplace.
Exactly right. You've got to actually embrace them and make them feel at home rather than just get them in the door. It's absolutely spot on. I've seen a lot of hands go up, and the best way for you guys to ask questions to our panel is using the Q&A in the Events Air platform. So start putting those in there, and we're going to try and answer as many of those questions as we can. I have one more question, which is, what is our responsibility here? What is it that we can be doing to make a difference, and how can we be better allies? And Reece, I'm going to throw this one to you to start.
So I'm going to respond with the smallest but most powerful weapon we all have, and it's been touched on by both my fellow panelists all the way through, including myself. Words count. Language counts. The way you speak counts. Think about how you address others, and try to walk not a mile, but 100 meters in somebody else's shoes. The more we can, the more empathy we can garner as a society, the more progressive we can be here. And I can only express again from my own personal journey that every time you think you've progressed yourself, you have but taken a few steps forward, and there is always so much more to understand about the way in which how we treat each other and how we interact with each other. And that language is the most powerful tool, and we all have it. Doesn't matter where you sit or what influence you have in society. You have a mouth, you have words, they count.
Thank you for that. Yasmin.
I would say look around you. That is incredibly important, because I'm talking again from my experience as a woman of color. Whenever I walk into a room, I'm looking around subconsciously. This is before, I always have, and thought, how diverse is this room? And I think that's something that is really powerful that everyone can do, because so often if we're constantly surrounded by these environments and we don't look around, it's easy to think of it as normal. But if you do, I guarantee you may very well notice that there is a distinct lack of diversity, whether it be cultural, gender, otherwise, et cetera, et cetera. And if there is a lack of diversity, what can you do about it? Who else can you bring in the room? What can you raise in terms of improving that diversity, and how can you use perhaps your privilege, or at least your platform, or as Reece said, your voice to try to change that culture? And I think the most important thing, that I think that's the first step towards making a change, is realizing that something does need to be changed. So wherever you go, whether it be a conference or it be, at uni or elsewhere, just look around you, see what you notice and see what you observe. And I think it will say a lot.
Fantastic. Rona, your thoughts?
Yeah, I think echoing both of what Reece and Yasmin have said, I think, we've all got to be agitators, whether we're within a system or we're looking at a system from the outside and we can leverage it with our power, our networks. I think that regardless of where we sit, whether we're from a minority community or we're marginalized or we are, hold a lot of privilege, we all have a role to play as individuals and collectives. And I think that, through what Yasmin is saying, looking around or using your words, as Reece said, we have, the opportunity to recognize how we can make change within our own systems and create the space in which we value and celebrate all people.
Fantastic, thank you. The questions have started rolling in, so I'm going to throw the first one to you, which is, when assessing the company, how can you tell if they are genuine about diversity? And Rona, you're on my screen, so I'm going to ask you that one.
I think starting with visibility is a great way to start, looking at a board of directors and senior leadership. And unless, there's people at the very top of an organization and the very bottom who reflect the diversity of the world we live in, that's an amazing measure or barometer for understanding, how diverse an organization is. Because if they take it seriously, they'll be creating quotas, they'll be ceding power, and there will be, diverse voices all throughout the company or organization.
Excellent. Reece, if we're just kicking off this journey as an organisation, where do you start?
You start by listening. I think that there's a natural tendency to sort of PR activities in diversity and inclusion, across the board. They're popular, it's the right thing to do. They're very marketable. And there's a tendency to leap to action to say, look at me, I'm doing the right thing. The most important thing is to listen to your own. So this is obviously a question for an organization, so maybe a business leader that has an organization. Listen to your organization, speak to your people, understand what the issues are. The issues that are unique, our issues inside IE are unique to our business and to our people, and we need to listen to them. And that's who you're doing. This is why you're doing it. So start by listening, then action, then feedback, then go promote it if you're that excited and you've done such a good job. But it's most importantly, listen, action, feedback, response.
Well, so the next one, what is it that you've heard when you have been listening? What are people telling you?
So I'll give you a good example, and this is a personal one. One of the reasons why I answered the last question the way I did is that, unbeknownst to me, I am but a human myself, and we encourage social friendships inside our business. I have friends as well. And I socialize the way I socialize. I was entirely blind to the fact that behavior was alienating for anybody that didn't feel like they were in that circle and therefore had maybe more access to what I was doing. It was completely inadvertent. I have friends I work with, actually acknowledging that, responding to that, and ensuring that it was understood that that's not how decisions are made, and that, and more importantly, that's not what's important in our organisation to get ahead. It was a really tough lesson to learn for me personally, because I was totally blind to the issue, but an important one, and that only came through listening. And I am proud to say we had a safe enough space that people felt that they could voice they felt there was a cultural issue. Yeah.
That's awesome. That's really great to hear. The next question that we have here is, what is an example of an organisation that is actually doing this well? And I'm actually going to ask all of you if you've got any examples of organisations who are really making their mark.
I don't know if I have an organisation as in like an actual company, but I think back to when I was, I chaired the Victorian Government's Youth Congress, and what that was their first ever youth advisory board, and it was representing over 1 million young Victorians. And what was incredibly striking about that was how incredibly diverse it was, and how it also put young people in the driver's seat as well. So we had diversity all the way from, refugee, Indigenous, to people that experienced the foster care system, someone that was disabled, someone that experienced, homelessness. I think it really centered the value of us within our lived experience. And that is something that I think lots of young people can bring. So I think that was, it's not an actual organisation, but that was incredibly youth driven with government support. It wasn't government telling us, what to be or what to do because we were advising the Minister for Youth. It was saying, you've experienced these systems, tell us what we can do differently. And I think that was a really beautiful example of what happens when you bring young people together in a room, and it was a fantastic thing to be part of.
I love it. I love hearing when it's working well. Rona, did you? Sorry,
Rona.
Oh,
no, Rona.
No, you jump in. All good.
No, you.
Sorry, I wasn't sure up to another question. Zoom etiquette. We could be here for hours. I wasn't sure if you're going to jump to another question. I just wanted to make a comment that my first thought, because I didn't necessarily have anything, I was immediately going to jump and say Atlassian, right? Which do a terrific job. But I think what is the danger in that is that, of course, they do, right? Like, they're Australian tech darling. It's ingrained. You just can assume that. And I think that actually, oddly enough, is where the danger is, because you have these organizations and a scaled SaaS business has a lot of money to reinvest back in its people, and it fights for the best and brightest minds, that they are so far ahead that the story that I wish I could say is, I wish I could talk about the meat processing company in Dandenong, or and I bet there is. I wish I had that kind of case study, because that's the front line. We can live sometimes in an echo chamber and get a little self-righteous. And I think that the challenge is to ensure that broader society is being brought on the appropriate journey in an appropriate way. So I would love to hear a more beige, God, that sounds terrible, doesn't it? But a more toned down, less glitzy sounding company that has done something exciting. But unfortunately, I don't have an example.
Right, Ronan, now we'll put you on the spot. Maybe you have an example of someone slightly less ritzy.
To be honest, I'm really stumped on this question. I was trying to think of the big corporates that I know that are doing it well, but honestly, I wouldn't be able to name any of them because I wouldn't feel comfortable, because you just don't know what's going on behind the scenes. My examples would be similar to Yasmin's around, spaces that are centering young people and their lived experience and creating really culturally diverse workforces from the ground up. And I think that, when you have the opportunity to start something new, whether it's a startup or a not-for-profit, it's a very unique moment. So I feel like there's a lot of small-scale enterprises across Australia that are doing this really well as they start out. But as Reece said, how do we ensure that everyone's on that journey, regardless of their resourcing or their education or their networks into conversations like these?
We've got a fair way to go, but look, it's good to see that we are achieving slowly but surely in small pockets, because I mean, we can only build from there, right? Okay, next question, and it's a long one. Diversity is so important and something I'm continuing to push at the companies I work at. But just pushing diversity goals or hiring more diverse people doesn't solve the issue, as the experiences of the individual minority groups are important as well. And it's always a challenge to balance to ensure that the diverse, different groups all have the great experience. What are your thoughts on this? Yasmin's smiling, so I'm going to go to her.
Kicking on me, Karen. No, I mean, I guess I would just echo what I was saying before in terms of creating spaces. So, I mean, even just thinking, so I think spaces is in, like I said before, you know, around women or, you know, culturally diverse groups or whatever that may be, and really creating support networks, because you don't just throw people into an institution that may be very homogenous or very, you know, white or male, etc., etc. That's not how you facilitate success, especially because that would reflect that existing standards probably wouldn't support someone that is diverse. So how can we frame that? And I think a lot of my strength that I draw upon is connecting to the Asian Australian community here in Australia. That's been so important for me being able to share my concerns and also aspirations, and then facilitating that. So I think that organizations really need to create those pockets within the organization that people can go to as a source of strength as well. And I think the second thing to that, and this was me thinking about the previous question, organizations need to be having frank, candid and open conversations around topical issues. So I think of Austrade, for example, and they, you know, I recently spoke on something about, you know, the bamboo ceiling and Asian Australian discrimination, but they'd done one about, you know, Indigenous Australians. They had like a 3-part series about, you know, Asian Australians and all this kind of stuff. And that was an organization-wide initiative. And that was really important for making others aware that wouldn't usually be in those little pockets of, you know, support around the issues as well. So that kind of 2-part approach of kind of education more broadly in the organization, but also, you know, the platforms and structures that can uplift and facilitate success, I think is really important to quotas.
Fantastic, thank you. We have one last question. Should the conversation be about diversity, or should it be about acceptance, and whose responsibility it is to educate and who should lead? Reese is nodding, so I'm going to go to him.
So oddly enough, we often forget the second word, inclusion. And that to me is perhaps more relevant to unpack, because let's think about what inclusion, the corollary is, or the opposite is exclusion, and the thought that so why might somebody feel a sense of exclusion? And that comes from the notion of I do not belong. So, or I am not like, or in order to belong, I must behave in a certain way, as I did, and as so many people do, to conform or to fit in. That's exclusion. So inclusion is about psychological safety and comfort, that to express your whole self, as we heard from Tina about Josephine at the start of, in our first presentation. That's a great example of the measure being Josephine's contribution to the workplace as measured by her ability to do the job, and the workplace's measure that they have delivered a place that Josephine feels that she can bring her whole self to work. And that is the essence of it. Who should lead? We all should lead.
Thank you.
I'm not dodging the question.
No, you didn't dodge. It's all good. Rona, I'm going to throw to you for the last comment on that before we start our speed networking.
Yeah, I think I'll just pick up on the last bit of the question, which was who should lead. And I think within the context of what I see in terms of reconciliation in Australia and inclusion around First Nations people within organisations and companies, I think often there is an onus that the First Nations people will be leading that work. Often someone will be hired who is, you know, has that lived experience to then reform the organisation from the inside, which I think frankly is utter bullshit, and it's actually up to non-Indigenous people within those organisations to be leading the charge on that. and that person is just there to be the voice to support, you know, the way that goes. And I've seen that time and time again, and I think it's a good reflection on, you know, you can't expect the person with the lived experience to always be leading the charge. You actually need to be creating that space yourself and supporting, you know, amplifying their voices and making the change so they feel psychologically safe within that organisation.
That is so spot on. Thank you so much for that. That concludes this part of the panel part of the evening. We are now going to move to speed networking. So we're all aware that we had technical issues before and some of you joined through Zoom. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask you to please join through the Events Air platform with the original link that you were given. You're going to be going through 2 rounds of 10 minutes of speed dating, and there's going to be 4 people randomly dropped in your room, and it could be one of these amazing people who you have been speaking to you this evening. Refresh your screen and ensure that you've enabled your microphone and your camera, at least your your microphone and your camera. Be seen, people. Don't be afraid to be seen. It's going to start at exactly 7:30, so it's going to give you guys a chance to do that, to join in on the Events Air platform, and then go for it. When you have finished, come back. We would like to see you for the end and for our closing remarks. So I'm going to send you on your way to Events Air. Get into your speed dating rooms. I look forward to finding out who you all met and what it is you all talked about. Gossip is good. And we will see you back here at exactly 7:50. Go for it, gang. Have some good chats.